Welcome to Frankly Speaking. This is a new podcast on responsible business by Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. And I'm Richard Howitt, and after several years of debating these issues inside the European Parliament, I speak frankly and personally about what moves policymakers, business and activists to make responsible business the norm. Today on Frankly Speaking, we'll be discussing the new European Union law for companies to respect human rights and environment in global value chains. It's known as Due Diligence, and I'll be speaking to its foremost advocate in the EU institutions, Lara Wolters, Dutch member of the European Parliament. Lara is Vice President of the influential Legal Affairs Committee, which is responsible for all European company law. She's deeply experienced in European policy making, having previously served as a policy specialist in the Parliament, in the Dutch Labour and European Socialist parties, and in EU public affairs. Lara was responsible for the own initiative report, which called for an EU due diligence law, and which passed in the European Parliament by a massive 504 to 79 votes. When the draft law was published in February this year, she became its parliamentary negotiator or rapporteur and is currently steering the legislation through the Parliament and the other EU institutions. In another context, in relation to EU rules for more women on company boards, Lara once said, "We have kissed the sleeping beauty awake." Lara, welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Now, on human rights due diligence, is it companies who need waking up?
I think so. Thank you for the introduction, by the way. That was very flattering to listen to, and nice as well, because I've been at it for about 3 years now, and it's quite nice to get a little summary like that, even for myself. But yes, in short, companies do need awakening. Some of them are taking responsibility seriously already, but unfortunately, many are not.
And you know, I've worked in the business and human rights field for years, part of getting the UN guiding principles together. Very proud of what you're doing, Lara. But you don't meet many people who are against human rights, who would say we shouldn't respect human rights. But clearly there are problems out there. What are the sorts of problems that this is dealing with?
Yeah, well, very concrete things. Deforestation. Only last week I sat with some women from West Papua who said the rainforest where we live is being chopped down for palm oil plantations, child labor in the World Cup that's coming up now. Probably some of the merch that will be sold there, you know, the t-shirts and the footballs, will have been made with child labor, forced labor. I think we're all familiar with the Uyghurs and their situation in China. There's lots of problems that go hand in hand with all of these. So there's often where there's conflicts because big companies are moving into local areas. There's sexual violence, there's corruption and bribery, and that often goes hand in hand with bad labor conditions for people. Things like not being allowed to join a trade union or not being allowed to strike. So those are the kinds of problems that we're talking about.
Now, we already have the EU reporting regime, the directive that I was personally associated with, which has been updated, and where you were a shadow rapporteur. And so companies already have the obligation to report on human rights. So why do we need a new directive? What's different from what is already there?
That's a question that so many people have asked me, but for me that's quite clear, because we've done a lot as the EU on transparency. So, asking companies to be clear on what it is they're doing with regards to sustainability in the broadest form. So what are you doing about climate change? What are you doing about labor rights? That sort of thing. But transparency is still very different from behavioral rules. It's very different to say to someone, well, I want you to be, open about, what goes on behind the scenes. That's very different to saying, I want you to make certain changes behind the scenes. And that's what we're doing now. And there's quite some criticism from big players saying, well, we've already been asked to do so much on this topic, on ESG, on environment and social governance and on sustainability. And why is it that you want us to do more? And I think that's quite simple, because it's not only about being transparent, it's also about actually doing the right thing.
I couldn't have put that better myself. And the work that Frank Bold does in surveying the sustainability, the ESG reports of businesses, show that vast majority of them report very effectively on their policies on human rights. But in terms of actual outcomes, I think it's only 4%, the latest survey showed. And so I can certainly see the case that this directive will make a difference in actual behaviour, not just in the reporting.
Maybe interesting to mention there is that transparency can make some difference, just not enough, I think. But there's this saying I read somewhere, which was, what gets measured gets managed. So this idea that once a company needs to report on certain things and needs to, stick figures on it and needs to look into something, that it will start managing that issue more, because it'll realize that actually we're spending a lot of money on, for instance, compensating local communities somewhere, or so it's not that there's no effect. I think transparency can have some effect, but as said, they're vastly different things.
Now, on the question of the new directive, we can't go into all of the detail in a short podcast such as this, but I'm sure that there are areas that you've got concerns about what's in the draft, where in the Parliament you're going to be trying to pursue changes. What are some of those areas?
One of the areas is whether or not, as a company, you should be taking responsibility for your whole value chain or not. And that's a big bone of contention in these negotiations, because if you look at where the biggest problems are, then usually they are close to, first of all, they're far away from Europe often, and they're close to raw materials often, or in early stages of the manufacturing process. So think of mining, for instance, children being involved in mines, or forced labor conditions to do with mining minerals, people in factories, people in the textile industry. These things are usually not close to Europe, and they're not close to, let's say, the finished product that European consumers will buy. And so I find it really, really important that we say to companies that when they look at what their effects are on potential human rights abuses or disastrous outcomes for the environment or for climate, that they need to look at their entire value chain. Because if they only look at whoever was the last person who supplied them, the almost finished product, then probably they won't find many problems, and probably, we won't really make any difference with this. But then that concept of, well, you got to look at the whole value chain right down to all these other suppliers, and that meets with a lot of resistance from business. And the other thing they say is, well, you can't possibly hold us responsible, or more importantly, liable for everything that happens very far away from Europe. But that shouldn't stop companies from trying, and it shouldn't stop them from taking an interest in what happens and in zooming in on where the problems might be the biggest. And in the textile industry, those problems that might be forced labor or child labor, and bad labor conditions. And in mining, it might be different problems, or more to do with the environment. And you want them to focus on those things, but not say, well, that's so far away, you couldn't possibly ask me to do that. But especially then when it comes to liability, that's going to be a really, really tough question for us to answer, where liability starts and stops. And luckily, we've got some beginnings of an answer due to work that's come before, and that you have contributed to in the UN at OECD level.
Your own initiative report was very clear that you can prioritise, and business and human rights experts are really clear. You do it on the basis of analysing risk to people, human rights risk, and the severity of that risk. And you do it as a business depending on your size, scale and capacity, in a way that is proportionate, but which doesn't lose sight of the risk. So I think we both think there's a very, very good answer on that. But you refer to liability there, and that's another thing that can make companies very nervous. Are we going to end up being fined or end up in court. But it could also make victims and victims groups very nervous, because 10 years plus now since the UN Guiding Principles, that Pillar 3 access to remedy and access to justice hasn't yet been sorted. Does the new directive, and will the new directive really answer that?
If I were to write it myself, by myself, with no one else, then absolutely. Can I promise that we're going to be able to do something good here for victims or for people sort of on the other side of the world? I really hope so, and I'm going to fight really hard for that. But as said, that's going to be one of the toughest fights. And you mentioned, that you and I both have very clear ideas on the responsibility that you have as a business and this prioritization, and where you should be focusing your attention. And one of the issues is that responsibility and liability are not the same thing. But for many companies, it's this sort of blurred line. And the reason is that they're afraid that once we say that you do have a responsibility to map out that entire value chain, that liability will follow. And so then in the literature, there's a lot of very smart people who have thought about all these questions already, but there's this difference that's being made between, have you caused harm, have you contributed to it, or are you linked to it in some way or another? And for cause and contribute, it's quite clear then that you have responsibilities to remedy a situation. And maybe that can also help us with the liability question. But for issues where you're linked to them, things become a little bit more difficult. And I sometimes compare it to, walking down the street and seeing someone get beaten up. And if you see someone get beaten up, then you might throw your hands in the air and say, I didn't do it. Nothing can be expected of me because it wasn't my fault. But if you see that, then you do have a responsibility to go and call the police and to go over to that person and ask if they're all right, and maybe to go by the next day with a bunch of flowers. And those concepts of where does your responsibility start and end, and where does your liability start and end, those are so important, especially for those victims or for people who are, making our footballs under forced conditions or that kind of thing. And civil liability can help with that. But there too, there's a lot of resistance. One of the things we did in my draft report was say, well, the burden of proof. So the difficulty in gathering evidence for a court case shouldn't lie so much with victims. So say people who have had their land taken from them. What we need to do instead is we need companies to prove that they took all the steps they could to prevent environmental damage or to prevent something like that from happening. And there too, businesses are very, very concerned. And I say, I'm gonna do my best to get a good outcome here, but this is definitely going to be one of the biggest fights.
But a recommendation of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, so one of the EU's own agencies, has of course recommended that reversal of the burden of proof. Another criticism that you see in here about the draft that came out is that it might descend into being a bit of a box ticking exercise, because there's an overemphasis on companies being able to put into contracts, follow this or that code of conduct, and then simply trying to pass the risk and the responsibility down the supply chain and say it's not us folks, rather than an emphasis on companies working with their supply chain, engaging with them, and indeed engaging with their stakeholders. Would you agree with that criticism? Do we expect to see any changes there?
Yeah, I've been very vocal on that myself. I think this business of contractual clauses, so basically using contracts to then codify what responsibility goes to whom, I think that's quite dangerous. And I don't think that the concept itself is unuseful. I think can be very useful as a tool to say, well, this is what I expect from my suppliers if I'm a big company. But what I'm worried about is that it'll be taken as the tool for for sleeping soundly at night, if I can put it like that. And what we wouldn't want is big companies to go, okay, basically what I need to do is just set up a bunch of contracts with suppliers and pass, the sort of hot potato onto them, and then everything's fine. And so what I've been looking into is the concept of responsible contracting. And there's two things I want to do. One is I want to make sure that we don't get an overemphasis on this contracting thing. So yes, you can do that. No, it is not enough. But two, if you use those contractual clauses, then they basically need to be clauses that make both parties in them responsible. So not just, chucking responsibility over the fence to the next person down your value chain, to your supplier, but, holding on to a piece of that hot potato, if I could put it like that. And together, if there's problems down the supply chain, being responsible for fixing them.
And as far as the stakeholders are concerned, the whole aspect of the UN Guiding Principles was engage with stakeholders, talk to them, have dialogue. And when you see in the draft directive that companies are asked to have consultations with stakeholders, quote, where relevant, unquote, it doesn't really reflect the spirit of the Guiding Principles. So I hope that's another area that you will be looking at.
The group of women I talked to last week, they had a great and tragic example of that. They said these big companies came, to start chopping down the rainforest that we depend on. And we had a meeting where we were asked to sign some sort of attendance register. And afterwards, what was done was the signatures that they put in there were used to say, you've signed away the rights to your land, right? And that kind of thing I've heard many times, or information being being given out by a company, and the information isn't in a language that anyone locally can speak. So indeed, very, very important to ask of companies that they do that type of consultation properly and meaningfully.
One thing that is in there, of course, is around directors' duties, the idea that company directors are responsible to oversee corporate due diligence. And that's produced a mixed response from the corporate governance community, even though it was strongly represented in the independent impact analysis on the legislation produced by the accounting company EY. Where do you stand on that, directors' duties?
There's never been so much interest in this directive from CEOs or there was never as much interest as when the European Commission were playing with the idea of making directors personally liable for wrongdoings. There was a huge amount of anxiety then. They've tweaked things somewhat, and now there's a duty of oversight. But there was a time when we were thinking, or the European Commission, which has the right of proposing legislation, and they were playing with ideas of how can we make directors more involved in due diligence, and shouldn't there be sanctions also personally if things go really badly wrong? Think, for instance, of a massive oil spill, and there was so much anxiety around that they've tweaked that. But still, now we get a lot of emails in my office from companies concerned, and always saying that it's not appropriate to necessarily make this a boardroom issue. And the funny thing is, I want it to be exactly that. I think one of the replies I get too from people who know a lot more about this than me, frankly, is that very often in a company it's very unclear where the responsibility for due diligence lies, right? Is it with people doing purchasing? Is it with people, doing the contracts for big orders? Is it with compliance? Is it with the lawyers in a company? And at some point I feel like everyone's kind of expecting someone else in the company to do these checks on, hey, is it, what are we actually, are we causing any damage anywhere? Is anyone suffering, on our account? And if you have that unclarity of where the buck stops finally, then I think what you need is exactly to make this Chefsache, as we would say in Dutch. I mean, that's a German word, but basically, you need to make this the business of the director, of the board of directors, and make sure that this is on their agenda, simply put.
Time's running against us, but it's a fascinating area. One of the things the European Commission want in their draft is for this to apply to non-EU companies that trade with Europe, and that so that any law that goes through in the European Union is going to have some international consequences. Is that a good thing?
Yeah, it's a good thing. And I think it'd be great if other continents look at this law and say, now that the EU has done this, we better do the same thing ourselves because it'll make things a whole lot easier. The difficulty about it is, and I support this very much, but the difficulty around it is the enforcement of it. And I completely agree with the concept, and I'll fight for it too. I think it's a question of, our market, our rules. And if we say that as the European Union, that we stand for certain values and that we're a norm-driven economy, well, then that has consequences. So we should say that, only products and services can be put on our market if they've been made responsibly, essentially. But my question is, how in the end are we going to enforce this? Because we're talking now about a forced labor ban. So products that might have been made with forced labor and stopping those at the border. But not everything is a product, and not everything, of course, is comes in via the border controls. We need to have a good long think about how do we do this and actually make it make it not just an empty promise on our behalf. But I believe in the principle very, very strongly, and I also think that only by taking steps like that and trying, that we can make a difference. Because I think that when it comes to China, especially, of course, we've asked nicely a few times, and I think now is the time to become a little bit stricter in our approach to what gets put on our market.
And I was at the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights when Commissioner Didier Reynders came and said, we're going to do this in Europe, and got huge applause. And it is true to say that a lot of people are watching what goes on in Europe. We've already had mandatory human rights due diligence, the California Supply Chain Act. The US have stopped goods at the border for the reasons that you say. We've got anti-slavery legislation to look at supply chains in Australia and the United Kingdom. But there's no doubt, we've seen the pressure within Europe from Germany, from France, from Finland and others, but there's no doubt a European-wide directive on this would be a leader in the world. And so the eyes are watching you, but I think you know that already.
Yeah, no pressure.
Already, Lara. Do you mind if I close on a more personal question, which is that these are deep issues, aren't there? Child labour, forced labour, sexual harassment and discrimination and violence, meeting the victims of human rights abuses. What is it in your personal background, in your life, in your values that really makes you want to do this?
I don't think there's anything that gives me as much energy as anger. The anger, you feel when you see blatant injustice. But I suppose where this comes from is I grew up in a family of parents who always worked for NGOs, and so they always worked for organizations that, in one way or another, were trying to do something good for society, I suppose. But in that, I think that I was very aware always of the sort of underdog positions that many of these organizations have, because you might be working with a whole lot of energetic people over at Greenpeace, trying to stop companies from chopping down the rainforest or polluting so much. But so often they're up against it, and they're working very hard. But when you've got huge multinational companies that have more turnover than the GDP of some developing countries, then that's just going to be a drop in the ocean, and you're going to lose. And seeing that and hearing those stories, at the kitchen table, I suppose for me has been a huge motivator in where I stand in this whole discussion on responsible businesses. And I suppose that's what's made me gravitate towards this fight.
My kitchen table too. And you've talked about fights and struggles, and clearly there are going to be arguments on all sides as this goes through the EU. Are you optimistic in the end that this is going to pass?
I'm optimistic it's going to pass. I think both the left and the right side of the European Parliament are invested in this now and want this law to become a reality. I think from the liberal and the right side of the house, because it'll give businesses a lot more clarity from the progressive side of the house, more because we think that people on the other side of the world need us. But I'm more cautious as to the content of the law. I think it'll pass, but the form and shape I'll work my ass off. I'll do my best to make sure we get as progressive a result as possible. But that is something that you'll have to ask me about again in 6 months.
Well, we wish you every success, Lara. And one of the things that makes me optimistic is that what you were talking about in terms of being moved, being angered by some of the stories that have really moved you to act. I hear that increasingly from people within business. And if you look at all the lists of businesses that came out in sending letters and declarations to the European Commission that they did want this positively, that certainly makes me positive about your prospects for success. So very, very good luck. Thank you very much to Lara Wolters, MEP. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our podcast. And of course, we would like to invite all of our audience to send us your feedback via social media and by email to franklyspeaking@frankbold.org and to share our conversation. You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Watch out for our next episode and find out about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Richard Howitt. Thank you again for listening, and goodbye.